You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're discussing the huge increase in the number of young people living at home. Do you know any adult children still living at home? Chances are you do, since new figures from the Office of National Statistics show 1 in 4 young adults still live with mum or dad, as rising house prices and the recession prevent them from moving out. That means more than 3 million British people aged in their 20s and early 30s still live at home, a 25% increase since 1996. Today we discuss what that means for families and for society. Joining me in the studio is Matthew Pointon, a property economist at Capital Economics. Economist Angus Hanton is the co-founder of the think tank Intergenerational Foundation, describing himself as acutely aware of the debts passed on to today's younger generation. Ed Cumming is here. He's a feature writer at the Daily Telegraph and a member of the Boomerang Generation himself. He's recently been forced back home. Joining us on the phone is Harriet Bradley, Professor of Women's Employment at Bristol University. Thanks everyone for joining me here at the Voice of Russia in London today. Ed Cumming, I'd like to start with you then. You moved out of home, but now you're back with mum and dad. Tell me why.
Well, it's interesting that you said forced there. And while a lot of people in my position are forced, for me it was really more of a choice. I graduated in 2009, started working at the Telegraph, and moved out. As young people do. I should say, sorry, my parents do live in London, obviously. I moved out to a little house in Mile End with 3 friends, same age, doing similar things. Classic kind of graduate house with 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, little garden. An hour commute on the tube into work every day, and it was great in some ways, but gradually I was just thinking, why am I doing this? I'm spending sort of upwards of £700 a month in rent and bills off what was not a massive salary, and I kept finding myself going back home for just to say hi, or just for dinner, or to see my family, to check in. And I thought eventually, why am I doing this? This is madness. They were pleased to see me. Their house has room for me to live in it, and I could have so much more disposable income and so much more saving by living there. So after a year, I said, would you mind me coming back? And they were happy to have me, and I'm still there now.
Matthew Pointon, you're involved in the UK housing market. How common a story is that, do you find?
Well, it's becoming more common, certainly. I mean, what we've seen from the ONS stats is that, although it's always been quite high, the trend rose after about 2008. And, of course, that coincides with the financial crisis, the onset financial crisis. That hit the youth in 2 ways. First, youth unemployment shot up. They were by far the worst hit group. And secondly, the mortgage market changed dramatically, and you had to have a very large deposit to be able to buy a house. So young people found they couldn't buy a house. Rent's always been quite expensive, and so some of them were forced just to move back in with the folks, partly because they can then save. As Ed said, if you're not paying rent, you can therefore save a lot more, and that should help you get on the housing ladder sooner.
What about the gap we're seeing between average salaries for young people and average rent, as you mentioned, or house prices?
Yeah, so the house price to earnings ratio is still very elevated. We saw house prices come down following the financial crisis, but actually not that much considered where they got to. So now it's about 6 times earnings house prices. So many people literally can't afford to buy a house. And that seems to be getting worse now because the housing market is recovering, prices are going back up. And in London, it's particularly acute. House price earnings ratio there is now close to 9. So unless you're a very wealthy person, you're not going to be able to buy a house in London.
Yes, is this trend that we're seeing of young people either going back home or staying at home in the first place, is that particularly London-centric, or is it easier to move out of home perhaps in the smaller cities or the regions?
Well, again, the stats are interesting here because the ONS actually show that in London it's a small proportion of young adults living with their parents. So it's not all about cost. I mean, London obviously attracts lots of young people. They move here for work and they haven't got the option of living with their parents because their parents don't live in London. So they're forced to rent or share houses, and it's not uncommon for the youngsters in London to be spending half their income on rental payments. And that's because they have to do that and they have to come to London.
Angus Hanton, you founded the Intergenerational Foundation partly because, as a baby boomer yourself, you felt guilty about the difficulties being passed on to the next generation, if I'm right. Yes. You say the housing market and the rental market are rigged against the young. How unfair is the imbalance between what the older generation have and what the younger generation have not?
Well, it's extraordinarily loaded in favour of the older generation. And when we talk about the plight of the younger generation, we've got to see that it's linked, so that when they pay rents, they're typically paying rents to an older landlord. So it's a transfer, an intergenerational transfer in the wrong direction from young to old. And particularly if they buy a house, as Matthew said, if they're buying a house on 9 times their earnings, they're in effect giving away, when they take on a mortgage, they're giving away their income for many years, maybe 2 or 3 decades ahead. They're giving away, and they're giving it to the person they buy the house from, who is usually an older person, who is getting a windfall, tax-free transfer from the younger generation. But I mean, housing, of course, is just one aspect of this. We've deprived the younger generation of economic well-being through pensions, through the build-up of the national debt, and particularly, going back to Matthew's point, the way that younger people get paid, the number of internships and so on, means that what we've seen over the last 20 years in terms of wage differentials between those in their 20s and those in their 50s is that you would expect, of course, older people to earn more on average, but that extra that they earn has increased by 50%. This is recent research that the Intergenerational Foundation has done. So that's a huge increase in differential. So it means that younger people, even if they're in work, are finding it very hard to afford rents and mortgages because they're not paid as well as their parents would have been at the same stage 25 years before.
Professor Bradley, can you add to that? How difficult are young people finding it, and how difficult are they finding it to get a job in the first place?
They're finding it extremely difficult. And there are 2 factors which come together to cause this. I really agree with all that the last speaker said. First of all, the property market has gone through the roof, particularly in London, of course, but even in other cities, it's still very difficult for young people to afford the rents. The other thing that's happened is the downward pressure on wages. Recent economic policies are pushing Britain, like other European countries, into a low-wage economy, and the young people, unfortunately, are on the sharp end of that, so that even if they do get jobs, they're often jobs which are not particularly well paid. A lot of them are on zero-hour contracts. It's been mentioned already that a lot of them work for free in internships and placements. So they are struggling economically. And they're also facing the fact that it's very difficult for them to make long-term plans because so few of these jobs are the old jobs for life, which my generation were able to procure. So making plans is very difficult for them, which is why they tend to boomerang, because it's not just that they go home and stay at home. They go home, they get a job that seems to promise well, they leave home, they take a flat like your first speaker, and then they find it's really not sustainable or it's a bad economic prospect, so they go back home. So we have a picture of young people's lives being so fragmented in and out of work, in and out of training. It's just very different from the life of my generation, where when I left university, I think all my friends were able to afford rent for rather grotty flats, but they were still flats. Then we managed to secure a job and we got a house and started income. All this is really not on for today's young people, and I do agree. I think that it's a deliberate plot by the baby boomers, but I do think, I feel very sorry for the young people compared to the experience of my generation.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're looking at the growing trend for young adults to live at home with mum and dad. I think we can all agree there that it is very difficult for young people today. I want to talk about then what sort of effect that's having on society more generally, and particularly the family dynamic. Ed Cumming, I'll come to you since you are one of the Boomerang Generation yourself. What's it been like for your family having you back home? Did your parents welcome you with open arms?
Yeah, it took some getting used to, I think. But the obvious jokes that people make when you talk about going home revolve around things like doing the laundry and, cleaning up after yourself and going back into those adolescent ways. In reality, it hasn't really been like that. It's actually been, from a familial point of view, really nice. I've got siblings who are also at home. We're all kind of grown-ups. My brother, who's also earning, he's younger than I am, but he's living there too. We all have meals together. We try to chip in a kind of adult way and help our parents out. And it feels very nice, actually, and it feels much is much more sociable in some ways than the flat I was living in with these friends who were also in their 20s, living, very kind of fragmented lives, going off with boyfriends or girlfriends, going out, working late, and often there'll be nobody at home. Whereas this feels much more kind of like a community that you go back to that's reliable. And I also don't really buy this idea that you read a lot that somehow it stops us becoming mature and independent. I mean, I really never, paying my council tax bill or my gas bill out in Mile End, I didn't feel suddenly like this was making me a grown-up. And actually, learning to get on with one's family as an adult is surely as important an act of maturity as anything that you might do in a grotty student flat in the East End.
I would definitely want to come back to that point, but for now, Angus, you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's obvious that Ed is an easy guy to get along with, and he's also in a privileged position, really, with a family, with a house near to where he works, so that's relatively lucky and unusual, and a family that has spare space there. But of course, there are huge numbers of people where they're very much involuntary residents in their parents' house, and for quite long periods. So I think, although Ed's very much making the best of it and set up a good situation, it's fairly untypical. There are, of course, countries where there's a culture of staying at home, such as in Italy. There are many more people, young people, staying at home, and they're more likely to stay with their parents for a long period and have 3-generation houses and so on. But the real change here has been this enforced staying at home by young people who either don't have work or really do have work but still can't afford housing and are saving for a mortgage or hoping that their wages will go up enough for them to pay rent.
Ed, that's an interesting point you make about having a more adult relationship with your parents when you moved back. But I want to pick up on something else that you said. Do we think there's any sort of negative aspects then at all of people moving back home? Are people failing to gain independence? Are they perhaps spoilt? Or I'm not saying you are, Ed, but perhaps people we might know. Does anyone have an opinion on how it affects people socially if they spend more time at home rather than out in share houses or on their own?
Well, one of the things I think is it's very difficult to see how they can build a family in such circumstances. I mean, a new young family of their own. It's obviously the case that people are choosing later to have children. But it seems very difficult to see how people can get into a secure position. I think one of the interesting facts, which hasn't been mentioned so far, is that men are more likely, like Ed, to go back home than young women are. And I think that's because young women do want to have families and children, and so to them it's quite important to get independence. I think they don't want to be stuck at home with their parents when they start their own family, particularly if they've got a husband, father with them. On the other hand, of course, they like to live near their parents so that they can have grandparent help if looking after the children, raising the children. It's quite complex, I think. There is an argument that this has strengthened the family in Britain, and that was the argument Ed was making, and I think you can argue that. Perhaps we're moving closer to the Mediterranean pattern that you mentioned, Italy and Spain, where this has always been the case and where the family is very strong. And sociologists, I'm a sociologist, have often argued that the family is in crisis in Britain, something I've never believed. I think families are very important to people, and people like their families. However, people also do value independence, and that's not just the children, but some of the parents, particularly for poorer parents, having lumbered with looking after children and essentially subsidising them, is quite a burden. I have a situation where my stepdaughter has 2 young children. She's a single parent. She doesn't live with me because her job is in London, but I have to subsidise her rent because she can't possibly afford to pay those huge prices in London. So that ties me down in a way that I'm not that happy about, and it's unpleasant for her. She doesn't like having to depend on me for extra money, and she would like to be fully independent. And I think that is our culture in the UK. A lot of people do want that independence, and when it's voluntary, like Ed describes, it's excellent. But I think that really is the exception, and that particularly for poorer families, this puts a stress on the family rather than being a pleasure.
Yes, but what's really surely underlying all this is a shortage of housing. Everything really comes down to the fact that we haven't got enough housing, and particularly where the jobs are. So whether that's London or other cities where there are employment opportunities. And that's not just a shortage of new building, which definitely is a problem, and that arguably has been partly because the older generation have said that they don't want extra housing in their backyard, and if they've said that as a whole, it's meant that there's been a huge constraint on housing. But the other thing is about how we use our housing stock, that we've got a lot of older people living longer, which of course is a great thing, rattling around in half-empty or three-quarters empty houses. They're not happy there, so we need to do more to encourage downsizing to free up our housing stock.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up actually, because perhaps parents are hoping to downsize. Perhaps they're in the situation where they'd like to get a smaller house and start spending some of their kids' inheritance, but they feel trapped into looking after their adult children because they can see how difficult it is for them. As an economist, Matthew, is that something you're seeing?
Well, it tends to do a circular argument. You want downsizers to free up the houses, but then the people living in those large houses can't do that because they're worried their kids have to move back in with them. And so you get into this bit of a cycle, which can be a problem. I mean, clearly, you're very right that Angus is right that the housing stock as it stands, if you look at the supply of it, the big numbers, it doesn't show up a problem. You know, if you compare dwellings to households, in fact, we've got more dwellings compared to households than any time since records began. The problem is those houses are in the wrong place, and those houses are being underoccupied. Now,
is that across Britain, that figure? It's not just London centric?
That's across Britain, that figure, yeah. So London is definitely more of a real supply constraint. But how do you get people to downsize is an interesting question. I mean, I think clearly taxation plays a large role. Housing is a very undertaxed asset in this country. We could do a lot more there.
So what taxes would you increase to encourage downsizing?
Well, at the moment, if you buy a house and you have an owner-occupied house, you don't pay tax on the consumption of that housing service. If you rent, your landlord does, and therefore you do pay it. So there's a different bias in favour of occupation, which has led to housing being seen as an asset rather than as a good to live in, and that's certainly led to higher house prices. So if you had a proper annual housing consumption tax, which would be like the council tax, but properly linked to housing values and increasing each year with house prices, or down if they fall, then that should encourage people not to overconsume housing, which is what they're doing at the minute.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I mean, you're absolutely right about the lack of affordable housing, but this is also a question about rents. When I was young, again, it wasn't common to get a mortgage immediately. One had to work for a bit to get the level of income for that, but it was possible as a young couple to rent quite cheaply. One of the problems is the whole buy-to-let market, which we just talked about, has made housing into a commodity which is traded in. And the rents are so sky high, as you heard in Ed's case, that actually it's not economic for people. They can't save, they can't get a mortgage, so they go back, as he's done, as an economic strategy as well as a social strategy. And that makes a lot of sense. But I have to say I'm totally in favour of rent caps being reintroduced, because the situation, particularly in the desirable cities like Bristol, where I live, or of course London, is that the rents go up every year. The rent levels are shocking. More than half people's income is going on the rents. That, combined with the low-wage economy, is making a most irrational situation in which these young people find themselves trapped.
But controlling rents has all sorts of other problems. I mean, we tried that in the 60s and 70s, and one of the things we found was that it stopped supply coming onto the market. People didn't want to rent out their rooms or rent out their houses because they were worried about losing occupation and having the rent controlled by the government. I totally agree with you on the buy-to-let issue, and one of the things that the Intergenerational Foundation has done is a study showing how well buy-to-let landlords are treated from a tax point of view. They get 10% of their rent they put in their back pocket straight away, or they can spend it on improvements as their wear and tear allowance, which is clearly much more valuable in London than in other areas. And they can offset their interest if they've got a mortgage, which many of them have. They can offset that against the rent before they pay any tax, and they pay very little capital gains tax when they eventually sell, added to which that it's not very well regulated, the collection of capital gains tax from buy-to-lets. So I'm not sure if rent controls are the answer. A possible stronger answer, or perhaps additional answer, would be to take away or reduce the tax subsidies that buy-to-let landlords get.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and we're discussing the rising number of young people who find themselves living at home with their parents in their 20s and even their early 30s. I'm joined by Ed Cumming, a journalist at the Daily Telegraph who recently moved back home. Matthew Pointon is a property economist at Capital Economics. Harriet Bradley is a professor of women's employment at Bristol University. Also here is Angus Hanton from the think tank the Intergenerational Foundation. I want to move on to the possible resolutions of this. My own landlord owns upwards of 50 properties on my street alone, which is very difficult to contend with. But if capping rents isn't the answer, what can we do to help young people get onto the property ladder? Are things like shared ownership schemes working at all? Matthew?
Well, shared equity, that's a good point. Obviously, the Help to Buy scheme, the first part of that's a shared equity scheme. I actually have quite a lot of sympathy for shared equity schemes. If they're done right, they actually can share risks in quite a good way.
Just explain what those sort of schemes are for people who don't know.
Okay, so a shared equity scheme, you have a mortgage for, say, 75% of the house, and then another provider, it could be the government, it could be a private provider, gives you another 20%, say, and you don't pay interest on that. But if your house price goes up in value, then they take a share of that increase in value. And if your house price falls, then they take a share of the fall in the price. So it's good for a number of reasons. Where you don't have to get a bigger mortgage, so it can help people get on the ladder. It also helps insure them against house price falls because they're not exposed to the entire value of the property. If you buy a house with a 95% mortgage and then your house price falls, you've lost quite a lot. I mean, you've only got 5% in there, so that could quickly be eroded and you're in negative equity.
Is this working then, or is it just of such a small scale that it's not really making much difference?
Well, they've been tried to introduce for many years. The trouble is a lot of people don't like the idea of not owning their whole house. So they haven't been that popular in the past. The current scheme, the Help to Buy scheme, the first part of that is a very generous shared equity scheme, and that has been very popular because it's very generous. But private providers are coming to the market now. There's one company which has been doing this for a couple of years that hasn't taken off as much because it's much more expensive than the public version.
Ed, I wondered if you had a view on this. I don't know if you're saving yourself to eventually move out, but do you have any friends who are looking at trying to get onto the property ladder and finding it difficult?
Absolutely, yeah. Even I'm now saving quite a lot, but it will still take years and years without substantial help from an older generation, I guess, with a deposit. And sometimes my friends and I sit around and think about starting a pressure group called Up or Out to advocate house building. But you need more houses. Would it really hurt London to be one story taller in all of Zone 2 and 3? I don't think so. But we've got this culture of not building ever on the Greenbelt and never building up, which is madness because it's where everyone wants to be. And it's also, it's wrong to say that we all haven't benefited from lots of the increase in wealth that has, caused all of this. Generally to London is a much more prosperous place than it was in the late 70s or early 80s when lots of people, our parents' generation, bought their houses. So I think lots and lots of building is my solution.
Since house prices are clearly only going to keep going up, is there an argument for moving the jobs to where the houses are cheaper? We've seen a big push from this government for HS2 to build up Birmingham, Manchester and Leeds. Could the jobs move out of London? Or does the fact remain most jobs will stay in the capital? Well,
we've been trying to do that for 50 years. The government's had regional strategies. They've never really worked. The trouble is the economics of conglomeration, as it's called, are too powerful to offset the government schemes to try and move people to the regions. I mean, they occasionally move a department to Wales, for example, and that has a small effect. But it's very hard to stop people wanting to work together, like tech hubs, for example. It makes much more sense for all the tech firms to be close to each other so they can interact rather than be dotted around different parts of the country.
Angus, do you have any solutions then?
Well, it is necessary for the government to keep pushing things out of London because there's so much pressure there. But essentially, cities are good for us. People want to live together. It works well. And one of the interesting things from an intergenerational point of view is that people who live in cities tend to have fewer carbon emissions. So that's good for future generations to have us living together. Partly, I suppose, it's using less energy for transport and using less housing. So I think cities are good for us, and it would be more important to take up Ed's suggestion of building more intensively. One thing that we've looked at is whether there's more possibility for infilling, significantly more possibility for infilling than is currently being pursued.
Tell me what you mean by infilling.
Infilling, well, there are lots of little bit corners of land all over a city like London that could have developments in them. They're not all in the private sector as well. I mean, if you look on council estates, which were built very often when land was cheaper and were built at much lower density, they're very often parts of those that could be used for building new small blocks of flats. And I think some councils, Greenwich, for example, and others, are actually doing that and are actively looking at their portfolio. So social housing could be more dense, but so could private housing. So it's definitely something that more needs to be done about.
We're running out of time, but Professor Harriet Bradley, did you want to come in there?
Well, just a couple of points. Bristol, where I live, has done a lot of infilling, and it brings its own problems. Bristol, you may know, is the city in Britain with the highest density of car population, and everyone with their little tiny houses in the infill places has their little tiny car as well. So it's not as simple as all that. I think that we probably need to move out more in the suburban areas rather than sort of picking off those inner city sites. But what I really wanted to say is going back to the other side of the equation, things wouldn't be so bad if young people were earning better salaries. And so we also need to think very hard about the job market. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to come back. Unlike your other respondents, I'm in favour of more controls, not less controls. I think there needs to be a raising of the minimum wage. I'd like to see the living wage brought in. I'd like to see the outlawing of zero contracts. I'd like to see all sorts of economic measures which enable young people to get the same kind of income security that my generation had. And until that happens, I think we're still going to struggle to sort out the housing situation, although it's very important to do more building, as your other contributors have said.
Ed, I saw you nodding your head there, but I wonder, Professor Bradley suggested implementing the living wage, but from my understanding, that's still relatively low. Is anyone really going to be able to buy a house or even pay their rent if they're only earning the living wage?
It'd be easy to pay their rent, but no, they wouldn't be able to buy a house. You're quite right, and we do need more well-paid professional jobs as well, which will enable our qualified young people to get those jobs and get into the housing market.
Does anyone have any final thoughts then? We are nearly out of time.
Don't we have a problem when we've got pensioners who've got quite good pensions who are going back to work? I mean, we do want the older generation to work longer so that they aren't dependents for so long. But we surely have a problem when they're picking up a very full pension and then earning consultancy levels so that they're getting as much salary as they did before. And it seems to me that the government isn't really addressing this problem.
That brings us to the end of our discussion today. We heard from Professor Harriet Bradley from Bristol University, economist Angus Hanton from the Intergenerational Foundation, Matthew Pointon, a property economist at Capital Economics, and Ed Cumming, Daily Telegraph writer and bona fide member of the Boomerang Generation. Thanks to each of you for your time on Radio VR.